From where you're sitting, what do you see? What are you looking at or seeing through your interpretive lens?
This is the first year that my students don't remember 9/11. And the hard thing to teach about American history used to be the fear of the bomb and how totally all-encompassing the fear of nuclear annihilation was at mid-century. That used to be the thing that they couldn't quite understand. And now they don't remember 9/11, but they totally understand the fear of the bomb because these students have now grown up with active shooter drills and kind of this constant sense of alertness and a feeling that violence could come at any moment and that we take these actions to perform safety that can't keep us safe. And that shift, I think, is really a tangibly different way of being in the world than existed before. I think it's a really interesting thing about this moment.
As a scholar of violence, as someone who studies the culture of violence, right? What do we know about how publics become used to what was heretofore unimaginable? So thinking about these white supremacist attacks under Trump, thinking about the SPLC, FBI, and others saying this is an empirical fact that we're seeing a huge increase in right-wing violence, white right-wing. And when I write about it, I always insert the Christian part because folks don't want to talk about that part of the formulation. White right-wing Christian fascists, I will call them, militia types and the other. So when we think about New Zealand or Charlottesville or Pittsburgh, we go down the list, or these attacks all over this country. How do publics become used to this? Or how do they not? I know that's a very imprecise way to phrase it. I mean, what do we know about those inflection points?
Well, I think that there are two questions there. One of them is about the way that political rhetoric and policies that enact racism and violence within our culture normalize those ideas and create opportunities for both tacit and overt approval of that kind of ground level belief system. The other one is about how we formulate a public understanding that can place these actions together as part of a common history. And I think that that second part is where a lot of this seems new under Trump, but that second part is not new. We've been struggling with this problem since the 1980s when the white power movement formed and radicalized and became paramilitarized. And in large part, this is because it has done such an effective job at disguising how it is a social movement, as propagating its own narrative of itself as lone wolf gunmen, its events as scattered events. And you see, even today, when people are sort of aware of this conversation and the post-Charlottesville moment, we still have a journalistic tendency to divide these stories up from one another, and even activists are dividing these communities up from one another, such that we get the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh reported as somehow different than the Coast Guard officer's assassination list and armory that was seized just a couple of weeks ago, and that different from the New Zealand shooting. So we see an act of anti-Semitic violence, political violence, and anti-Muslim violence as somehow discrete, when in fact they're united by the same perpetrators, the same ideology, and the same belief system. And I think that in terms of confronting the white power movement, which I would argue to you is different in some ways, although it shares other things in common with political rhetoric or particular kind of politicians, I think that in confronting the revolutionary activists who are carrying out the violence, we have to have that framework of understanding.
We need to have a sustained conversation about whiteness and the ways that this belief that whiteness is inherently benign, not by black and brown folks, certainly not by white brothers and sisters who know this history, sort of this common cultural understanding that whiteness is benign. So therefore, we can't locate these events as something systematic, as representative of a movement with a hell of a lot of connective tissue. Because then that would require looking inward and saying, how was whiteness created through violence?
I think that's right. And I think we have a long, long history in the United States of the creation and maintenance of whiteness and other conjoined systems of power through violence. And that's why, if we really wanted to reckon with this kind of violence, it would require a response not only at the level of allocating more surveillance state resources to this. More FBI agents is not going to contain this, because the problem isn't just in law enforcement, which has its own possessive investment in whiteness, as someone might say. That runs through many other elements of society. So what you see in the history is that not only individual people, but entire systems are not only incapable of dealing with this kind of violence, but don't want to. They don't take the opportunity to confront it when it is in their court. And then the movement just kind of goes on without ever getting a decisive moment of being stopped.
How would you explain Joe Q Public or on PBS? You had that great segment, or in your writing as well. Where did white nationalism come from in terms of thinking about the linguistics of it, the semiotics of it?
Well, so here's the thing. White nationalism might technically be correct from a strict political science interpretive standpoint. And I think it is the way we can usefully think about earlier moments of, say, the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s when people are wearing the robe and hood and marching down the National Mall in Washington, D.C. with their faces uncovered. That's white nationalism. That's vigilantes who are out to defend the nation and to police a status quo power structure through a very violent strain of patriotism. That's what nationalism signifies to people. So when people say white nationalism now, I think it really obscures the radical nature of the white power movement. The reason they use the white power movement is because, first of all, that's what people in this movement say about themselves, and also because this group of people is not interested in protecting or anything else about the nation being the United States. The nation that they're interested in is the racial nation, which is a transnational group of people that they see in countries that they think can still be salvaged from an onslaught of hyper-fertile people of color, and that can be claimed as white homelands from which they can launch a race war that will then create a white world. That's the end game that many people imagine. So this is not simply overexertion of patriotism. This is a fundamentally revolutionary and radical movement that is transnational and implicitly violent and explicitly violent.
Now, in terms of the distinction between white supremacists and white nationalists, and again, please correct me, that white supremacists want to say black and brown folks, especially black folks in this country, are biologically defective. Whereas the white nationalists shift the rhetoric to say, okay, no, it's not necessarily biology, it's culture.
Let me say this. I think there are people in the white power movement who are white supremacists in the way that you've just described and who use culture in the way you've just described. And we could add to that list a whole bunch of people who have theological basis for their racism, who believe, for instance, that the Christian identity faith believes that all people of color are descended from Satan or from Cain, and believes that those people are not even human. So there's all kinds of different strains of racism within the white power movement. But the thing that I think is useful to make as a distinction is that white supremacy is much broader and much more common than white power activism. I mean, I'm talking about a broad-based but delimited social movement that is revolutionary in this nature, whereas I think white supremacists properly describe large sections of American society. I think we could think about our court system, our distribution of resources, our distribution of education, our urban spaces, and even individual belief systems that aren't violent. Many of those would qualify as white supremacist. So to me, that dilutes the extent to which I'm trying to put my finger on a very specific fringe group.
The Republican Party is the country's largest white identity organization, and it's been so at least since the 60s in the Southern strategy. But then the rhetorical shift is that white supremacists are those people over there, Kluxers and Nazis and people who want to blow folks up and shoot up mosques. It can't possibly be day-to-day racism by otherwise well-meaning white folks, because then now we're getting to dangerous thinking now. These are dangerous ideas because now you're implicating a whole culture.
And I think it does implicate large portions of our culture. I mean, I think white supremacist is simply a system that seeks to benefit white people above other people and people who believe that that system should be made that way. So there are people who do that overtly, and there are people who benefit from it without kind of interrogating what that means. But both of them are participating in a system of white supremacy. The other thing I would just say is I think that this is one place where the history of the white power movement is actually reveals something about broader American society and the shifts that we've seen in the last short stretch. So my book is about the period from the end of the Vietnam War to the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, which is the period when this movement really cohered and radicalized. And I talk about people like Klansmen, neo-Nazis, skinheads, violent tax resistors, Christian identity proponents, Odinists, and others who kind of all came together under this flexible ideology that connected them in the white power movement. And one of the interesting things about this is that this story gives us a piece of the history that had been missing from many people's common understanding. Because there was sort of an idea on both the left and the right about kind of a myth of being beyond race. So on the left, we talked a lot about the post-racial moment and what the Obama presidency meant for our country. People sort of thought we were moving past some of this. And I think even on the right, a lot of people sort of had a belief system around this. And you can look at things like colorblind conservatism or multiculturalism. People really were invested in the idea that there was a progress narrative in the United States about race. In that moment, when people were so invested in that feeling of progress, actually there was this very violent fringe movement where overt racism and racist violence had relocated and were mobilizing both people and ideas and resources on the fringes. And it's a through line that can kind of explain how we got from one of those things to our present moment.
So Charlottesville, when you saw young white men chanting that Jews will not replace us or they will not replace us, the Odinists and others, because I told folks this is not funny. Like somebody sending out these images, oh, they're dressed like Teenage Mutant Turtles. I was like, well, the Klan are dressed like Confederate ghosts. Those symbols have meaning for people in that community. You have to understand what they're signaling. But when you saw Charlotte, was it confirmation of what you've been studying? Were you shocked to be like, oh my goodness, this is right out of the literature? I mean, what was going through your mind?
When we see an event like Charlottesville, I think that the sort of performative nature of it and the uniformed nature of it and the highly photogenic nature of it tell us that this is a planned event that's highly organized. We should think about it as part of a public-facing strata of white power activity. I think the historical archive makes me ask two questions. One of them is, where are the women? Because in Charlottesville, we saw almost, I think, exclusively or maybe only almost exclusively men or maybe only a few women. But in every other moment of white power activism and even in Klan activism going back before the Vietnam War, women have done an incredibly important set of jobs for the movement that range from the reproductive work of bearing the white children that are required to avoid racial annihilation, to the symbolic work of signaling purity and virtue, to real activism of disguising people and driving getaway cars, to the social network stuff like marriages and taking care of each other's children. And all of that stuff has been very, very important to the movement. So my second question, in the period that I look at, the archive shows us two different spheres of white power organizing. One of them is this public-facing, above-board, outward. So I would include things like Charlottesville, rallies, marches, political campaigns, recruitment drives, public events, screenings of Birth of a Nation. And then at the same time in the period of my study, there's this complicated and very violent underground that's doing all kinds of other stuff. Paramilitary camp training, amassing weapons and material from armories and military posts, assassinating enemies, robbing armored cars and distributing millions of dollars to other groups around the country, training people in how to use the early internet. So those two spheres are usually conducted in the earlier period by the same people. And people are very, very flexible about circulating through legal and illegal activity. But the thing is that illegal part, the underground, is hardly ever visible at the time that it's happening, right? So as a historian, to get the archive that you need to really look at that, it's going to take another 10 to 20 years because you need court cases and FBI surveillance files and all kinds of other documentation. So I think one thing to think about is just that when I see that public-facing stuff, I assume that the underground is also active. The wave of violence we're now in seems to confirm that.
So you have this horrific event in New Zealand. Well, this didn't happen last week. It didn't come planned 3 weeks ago. There's a lag. So you're going to see more and more of these events. And because the mainstream news media is conditioned to the now, the immediate present, that the format doesn't allow for sustained discussion. So how do we understand, this is an example, of the global color line? Thinking about what are these international networks and connections?
On the one hand, I think that we can trace inflows to the United States. And in the earlier period, the kind of most visible examples might be the way that British Israelism came into the United States through Canada in the 1920s and 30s and then became Christian identity, or the skinhead culture, which came to us from Great Britain and then became sort of a hyper-racialized phenomenon in urban centers in the late 80s in the U.S. But then groups in the U.S. are also in that same period sending things out. So like Aryan Nations did mailings to all kinds of different countries. The Turner Diaries shows up in bookstores as far away as South Africa. And then some groups, Wotan's Volk and World Church as a Creator, have chapters in I think 41 countries for Wotan's Volk, and then World Church of the Creator definitely was in Australia. So if you're an activist in Australia, you can access things on the internet, but you can also read reprinted American white power materials like newspapers. You can send away for mail order sermons. It really is a milieu of stuff going around and connecting these places. And then back to your question about the transnational color line, I mean, this movement sees violence as a step in eventual global race war, but it wants to start in the communities and countries that it thinks it can salvage from racial others. So this movement has, through this entire period, been focused on the United States, Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, Southern Africa, and Europe as places that are white enough, quote unquote, to still be saved through the kind of warfare that they are planning.
Which are not coincidentally white racial settler states, at least 3 of them.
Not coincidentally, these are settler colonial states often. Yes, minority rule places like Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, have special significance in that way as well. The way that this color line thing is important is also connected to one of the main things that people need to understand about an event like the shooting at Christchurch, which is that the spectacular moment of violence is not in itself the end goal of that action. He's not done. What he wants is for that moment of action to inspire other people, to awaken other white people, to create political rifts that spur government action that will then awaken other white people. And this is all part of a long game that is meant to awaken white people in seizing white homelands, seizing different white nations that I've just described, and then eventually annihilating people of color around the world.
How is the internet being used to radicalize this generation? Basically, his manifesto is a set of memes.
So I do think that the technology seems new to us, but actually is not new to this movement. So because the white power movement went online in proto-internet computer message boards in 1983-84 with LibertyNet, and on those message boards was posting content including not only assassination lists, but also things like personal ads and recipes. So it was precisely doing the work of Facebook before Facebook. They've been doing that for decade. I think they've been effectively motivating social network activism since before the rest of us were familiar with that as an idea. But I think the new part of this is more in the viral and first-person shooter game aesthetic and in this series of memes. I will say that the manifesto, to me, also calls back to some essay collections published in the prior movement. Sort of the short topical essays is a format that many other white power writers have used. The Klan and the white power movement both have used a method of activism that has attempted to mobilize existing cultural form to appeal to and recruit people. So when I teach this to undergraduates, I like to show a picture of what a women's Klan robe looked like in the 1920s because they're very fashionable and streamlined and showing some ankle. And it was a very, for that moment, a cool thing to do, right? Like the Klan in the 20s was about joining clubs and going out in your new motor car and having something to do with all of the time that you now have in the transformed American economy. And the man who founded the second Klan was also in, let me just see if I